Okay, so here we are again to work with origins. We're at the end of questions of truth. We're at the end of part one. How do you guys feel?
I don't know enough about part one yet.
Well, hopefully we can put to rest some of our anxieties about part one. I was having.
Any closer to the truth.
We haven't come, if anything, we've gotten further away from truth, I think. Truth has become something like a question, right? Truth has become a genre, which is problematic, to say the least. But we have quite a bit to do today. We're going to start with the questions and readings that I have passed around to you. So hopefully some of you were able to at least look at it before class. I'm sorry, I sent it to the wrong class. This happens. I've sent it to the wrong class and they were not thrilled with it. But why not, though? Who doesn't want to read an excerpt of Pamela? Like, sort of, Pamela. No. So what I'd like you guys to do is read through this and try to answer, well, not try to, have a sense of where you think McKeon might go with these passages. So if you don't look at the first part on Borges, look at the second part under it, where I say a McKeon summary point for this first subsection. We'll start talking about the first subsection. That once it has been invoked, the standard of fidelity to an accessible reality cannot be relaxed at convenience, right? Once the claim to truth in facts, once the claim to history has happened, you can't put it back in the box. Right? So this becomes this problem of quantitative completeness that this chapter looks at, right? So, right, we can't just say, well, everyone else has to have facts enough but me because what I'm saying is obviously true, right? That doesn't work. So if overarching truth of the Protestant saints' lives rest on the demonstration of their factual truth, problems of how to achieve quantitative completeness and how to justify factual selectiveness may be dismissed only at peril, right? You can't just dismiss what you're going to include, what not to include, right? Methodology of selection becomes a real problem. You can think of this always as the ellipses problem, right? How much have you cut out of the sentence? How much have you cut out of your quotation? You can cut out enough that it's almost a different quotation. So I said if you could just put an ellipses for not in a sentence, right, with no one knowing, you silently change the argument. So this question of what are you selecting to represent and why, is problematic. For there will always be skeptical readers to absorb that the moral import of an individual life, and hence the great pattern it is narrated to exemplify, depends upon our conviction that what we are receiving is a truth undiminished in the telling. So we believe it only if we believe it, right? We believe it only if we believe the form that is coming to us in is legitimate. So what I thought would be a nice way to kick off this question of quantitative completeness and what do we do with this question of quantitative completeness? I wanted you guys to look at 4 excerpts, right, from major 18th century texts, 4 excerpts. The first is a section from Pamela, which you've probably read by now, hopefully read by now, a piece of anti-romantic epistolary of Shyamala, Fielding's great rebuttal, an excerpt of moral accounting from Robinson Crusoe, and a series of passages parroting the plain style of the Royal Society from Gulliver's Travels. Right, so these are really sort of your big 4 authors of the period. Right? Fielding, Swift, Richardson, Defoe. So what I'd like you to do is go through these and write a few lines about how they compare with questions of qualitative and quantitative completeness. What are they presuming to do? Are they trying to be quantitatively complete or qualitatively complete? Where do they rank? Right? Or what sort of formal fidelity and evidentiary plenitude are they reaching for? Are they claiming truth through form? Or are they claiming truth through giving us enough evidence? What kinds of truths and narration are at issue here, and what strategies are employed? So it's my hope that we can spend the majority of class today talking through these texts, and we can then fruitfully explore the issues McKeon foregrounds in this chapter and the chapters beforehand, right? Everything kind of gets summed up today. Whether you knew it or not, chapter 3 really does sum up. Actually, the last section of chapter 3 sums up all of part 1. So it's nice that it does that. And we'll explore what has really been at stake in part 1 and why do we care so far as the novel is concerned. If you remember, this is all about the novel at some point. So why don't you guys take 15 minutes or so and read through this, make some initial remarks, and we'll have a little discussion. And then Nicole is going to give us her wonderful presentation on Saint's Life to Spiritual Biography, which will be very helpful. And then we'll move on. Okay? We'll move on to the rest of the chapter. Great. So go for it. Okay. So let's talk about our different approximations of truth here. Pamela, Shyamala, Robinson Crusoe, and Gulliver's Travels, each in their own right. So what do you guys think in terms of their claims to truth, their forms to truth, what's going on? Maybe we can start with Pamela. Let me grab this for myself. So starting with Pamela. So you all will probably remember this moment. This is a really extraordinary moment in the text. Yeah.
For Pamela, can we consider that letters that the novel based on is like a kind of true documentation?
What do you mean?
I mean, the Pamela itself, there are some letters.
Uh-huh.
So can we take these letters as a form of true documentation?
Yes, absolutely. Well, she's the whole claim that Richardson makes, right, is these are true letters. These are true diaries.
Yeah.
There's a woman who is writing, and she's writing them, as they say, to the moment, right? At this, right? The joke that Fielding makes, right? At this moment, Mr. B is on top of me, right? Trying to spread my legs apart, and she's writing it, right? This sort of, really comical moment when he makes fun of this idea of writing the moment. But right, when you're reading this, right, that's the sense of these are a true documentation of what's going on in the moment.
So is it a formal fidelity?
It's
Used for one form of letters to tell truth.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You can make decision about the truth because there is no access to other characters.
There's no.
The parents and the master, most important. There is no evidence that master is a bad guy.
Right.
There is
Other
no
than our
evidence
telling
he is
from
good
Pamela.
guy.
Right. So right, we only have the one witness.
That makes it qualitative.
The one witness. It's problematic, right? Because she's an eyewitness
Mhm.
to her own experience, right? But there's no one there to back it up, right? Which is why we get skeptical if we're Fielding, right? We get skeptical. But when we're reading Pamela, or when you guys were reading Pamela, I don't know if you had the early 18th century experience, right? You read it and you start thinking of these really as letters and diary entries. And did any of you ever doubt Pamela?
Yeah.
I read with a skeptical eye. That's
But did you say, there's one thing you saying the story's not true, but when you were reading it, did you think Pamela was lying?
okay. No.
There were moments where I was like, I don't know if I completely trust. I didn't really like her.
Well, it's okay if you didn't like her. But it's moments where you say, oh, come on, that didn't happen.
There was
She's
never-
making
there was
that up.
never that sort of moment.
Right, you can say maybe the story's not true, but when you're reading the letters, you never thought that this was a woman who was lying to you.
I felt like she was over exaggerating.
That's
No, I
different than
always-
lying.
I always
Yeah.
assume that she's a victim.
It's a form of lying.
You assume that she's a
She's
victim.
a victim and just narrating whatever happened in
Until you get
details.
halfway through the novel.
That's her
Never mind,
naive
I don't wanna
perspective.
Uh-huh.
Right, there's a sort of a naive requirement in reading this, or a naive expectation that people who are reading this are not reading it skeptically in terms of, well, give me more proof. They're reading this as though this is this woman's diary and letters.
Mhm.
And the question is, right, if you read these as her diaries and letters, why would she be lying? Why would she be lying in her own diary? Right, that's the question that Samuel Richardson sort of asks us, right? Of course, right, this is her diary. Why would she lie in her diary that no one is ever supposed to see?
Mhm.
And so it has that sense of fidelity, right? Because in the fiction of the book, there's no reason why she would lie in a document that no one else is ever supposed to read. It seems like a strange situation. Yeah, Derek.
I always got the vibe that it was meant to be read by her mother and father eventually. So when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking, okay, keep in mind, Professor Shaw always saying, keep in mind the audience.
Mhm.
So what could she be hiding from her mother and father in these letters?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's like potential to lie right there about some little details or some major things. Like, we don't know. We weren't there. So.
Right, that's true. We don't know. We weren't there.
And we don't know what her parents are really like either. Like,
We
they
get
could-
their letters. That's all we
Yeah.
get, right? We get their letters.
Through her though too.
Through
There's
her
another-
copying them.
Yeah.
That's true. She's reporting them.
Yeah.
So there's certainly reasons for skepticism when we look at it from this other extreme skepticism position. But in reading it, right, the assumption is that she's probably not lying, given what we have is essentially primary documents.
Offered no evidence other than her stating that they're primary documents.
Well, no, we have the editor stating it. She doesn't state this, right? Pamela never enters into the publication, right? Samuel Richardson, the editor, is saying, here are these letters and private papers of Miss Pamela Andrews that I am circulating or I am printing for the benefit of all readers.
He's qualifying it.
So he's the one who's guaranteeing it. So it's not coming out of a fiction. He's saying these are these letters, and I have put them together. Why? Because I think that this is an exemplary person, and we can all learn from her. But they're private papers, right? So the sense is these are not something she meant for the world to see. This is something that he has convinced her to share, right? But they're historical documents, and that's the claim that he makes. Mhm.
So I think Pamela still has the authority, and we have in this case to accept it because it's probable, not because it's certain.
Mm-hmm.
So this, we can say this, to some extent, it is truthful because it is possible.
It's
not
possible.
because it's certain.
I think so, right? That there's, when you read it, I just maybe to paraphrase or piggyback off of that, do you think that any of this stuff is impossible?
Oh, come on.
Well, as an 18th
No.
century situation, this doesn't seem
It
impossible,
doesn't seem impossible, no.
Right.
Something
but there's a
seems
really,
improbable.
the improbable part,
Mhm.
right, is the part that Richardson is pushing, is that this girl actually is concerned about her virtue.
Mhm.
That's the part that just seems so improbable, that under all of this pressure, right, that she's not going to give in. And she's documenting this struggle over and over again throughout, but she's not going. That seems to be the only improbable thing. And then we have to ask ourselves as people, we don't believe it because we don't think that there's one like just woman.
No, I don't believe it because she just switches her mind halfway through the novel.
Well, she doesn't switch her mind. She has a revelation. She does marry him. But there's a different discussion we can have about Pamela.
She
And
doesn't give in before marriage. That's
Right, she doesn't give in.
Yeah, she
What
defended her virtue.
there's a difference, right, in being Mr. B's mistress and being Mr. B's wife, right? And when we look at the options, this is a sort of a socioeconomic look at who Pamela is. And this will become more important starting next week. I think Pamela is, the lowest of the low,
Servant class.
right? She is the lowest of the low who happens to be literate because she got lucky to be in this woman, right, Mr. B's mother's house, who taught her to read and write, which she normally wouldn't know how to do in her class, right, her people. She wouldn't know how to do this because she doesn't need it, right? You don't need to know how to read and write, to help someone with their hair, which is essentially her job, right? Help someone with their hair, do their corset, right, mend things, bring them water, right? So it's not something where she needs a lot of edification. And so she's really the lowest of the low, but she happens to have this one thing that separates her. And so what are Pamela's prospects in life?
Just
Being a servant.
Being a servant, right? Being a servant until she dies,
Yeah.
right? She might marry another servant,
Mhm.
or she might get really lucky if she's good looking and marry a farmer, right? She's super lucky and she won't have to be in service. Right? And she can be a farmer's wife, which sounds like a lot of work to me. But right? Her prospects are not good, right? There's no real upward mobility. There's sort of no online VA that she can get in her spare time at night to move forward. This is what she is, right? She's a servant, she's born a servant, she's going to die a servant. That's it. So what happens with this situation? Mr. B enters into this, and he recognizes this, it's beautiful, right? She's beautiful. That's the other thing in the family. She's beautiful. Right? So she's beautiful, and she's a servant, right? So he sees this beautiful servant, and he's interested in her. The only really unlikely part of this story, as far as I'm concerned, besides the fact that Pamela doesn't want to give in, is that Mr. B doesn't rape her on page 2. That's the truly unlikely part of this story. Why? Because he's essentially the magistrate who would prosecute this crime. What would the facts of the crime be?
Servant word against magistrate's word. Like,
And what do we know about servant women?
they're trying to move up the social ladder.
Well,
so
no,
why not?
she's not trying to move up this. She's a servant woman. Like, that's what she's there for. Right? That's the historical reality of this piece, is that this was something, it's like this unfortunate situation of women in the Congo, right? This is something you can expect to have happen to you repeatedly as a condition of being a servant woman. That's just the way life works. And so the really extraordinary thing is she's put in this situation where this doesn't happen to her immediately. And there's this negotiation between she and Mr. B, and she likes Mr. B. That's the other part of it that's sort of interesting, is that she also likes him. But there's no space in which this exchange can take place. Right? Mr. B's an aristocrat, or at least he's upper gentry. And she's a servant, and there's no space that's cut out in which they could possibly be in love. They could possibly have a union of equals. It just doesn't exist. It's not part of the conditions of possibility. It just doesn't happen. The best Pamela could hope for is what Mr. B offers her, right? I'll set you up and give you a lot of money, and you'll get out of service, and you'll live like a queen, a bourgeois queen, for the rest of your days. This is far beyond what any servant could ever dream is going to happen to her. And it's pretty good, right? I mean, this is letting us know that even though we think Mr. B and historic, like looking at it anachronistically, right? This seems awful to us, right? That this, guy could, abduct this woman, and he's consistently threatening to rape her and walking into her room at night. Think this is awful, but this is pretty restrained in the moment, right? And he keeps wanting to get her consent. It's important to him that he gets her consent, right? Which is a really humanizing move, right? That he recognizes her as a person, right? So there's a sense she could be taken out of service. She could be his mistress, which is the only kind of legitimate possibility, right? There's rape, there is suicide, and there's being a mistress, right? Those are the things. And what is it that Pamela decides she's going to do?
Suicide?
Well, she gets herself out of suicide. That's what's so interesting about the passage, right? She talks herself out of it. Right? That she's going to let Providence decide what happens to her. Right? She says what's important is that I stay true to my values, and if something awful happens to me, something awful happens to me. But I'm not going to compromise. Right? So Pamela is in this extraordinary story, on the one hand, of a servant woman who actually takes seriously the idea that she has a spiritual self that's worth something, right? It's not so much that, she obviously does fear, right, sexual assault. She's, not looking forward to this as an inevitability of her life, but she doesn't want to be complicit in it, right? She doesn't want to give any sense of saying, I invite this, this is okay, I consent to this, because that's against her beliefs, right? That her virtue is important. It's important to her. Her salvation is important to her. And by compromising that in any way, shape, or form, by giving in, as she's continually, right, told to do, she would be compromising her virtue, and she won't do it. So that's sort of plot one of this story. This is the story of a woman who refuses to compromise her virtue, who happens to be an unlikely source, right? A beautiful housemaid who's a teenage girl. So Richardson is giving us this perspective. On the other hand, this is this really wacky love story between these two crazy kids, Mr. B and Pamela, who really like each other. But there is no possibility in which they're allowed to like each other, right, as equals or something like equals. It just doesn't work. And so the other part of this story is sort of the extraordinary lengths that Mr. B goes to in order to value Pamela differently than she's valued by society. In order to sort of break with everything that he knows, everything that culture enforces, to marry a servant. Right? It's just not done. It's just not done. Right? And so there's this one line in which we read it that this is about the terror of sexual assault. It's also about resisting complicity on the one hand. On the other, it's about this impossibility of these two young people from very different social stations finding a way in which they can legitimately have feelings for each other as something like equals, in which equal doesn't necessarily mean economic equal. It means equal in terms of your virtue is as important as my virtue. Right? In the eyes of God, we are both souls. And that's the way that Mr. B, right, that's the loophole that he follows. And he only gets there, right, by being a better person. Right? He's not a great person when the story starts. He's not a bad guy by early 18th century standards. He's just kind of a guy. You know, guy with a lowercase g. He's just kind of a guy, 18th century guy. There's nothing all that special, about it. He's good looking. And he's young and he has some money, but he's no Mr. Darcy.
Oh no.
Yeah, no. Right, so he's no Mr. Darcy. But he's just this sort of guy who then becomes interested in this woman and goes through this very long spiritual education, right, in which he really has a conversion. Where he reads Pamela's letters, he reads her diary, and then he kind of figures it out, right? He understands the interiority or the truth of Pamela by reading Pamela's diaries, right? Because the theory that's going on in the novel, right, from Mr. B's perspective, is these are these letters and diaries that he's trying to get his little mitts on, right, for most of the story. Right, she has them sewn into her dress, right, so he can't get them. Right, they're hers. They're private. They're not for anyone to see. And so by virtue of their claim to privacy, they gain an authenticity for Mr. B. Right? She doesn't want him to see them. Right? She hides them, really at her peril, over and over again. She's hiding them. Right? And so when he reads them as the real truth of her interiority. So we can think of the several levels in which truth is playing out, right, in this story, right, and what it means for something to be seen as true and by what level of readership. And on some level, we're surrogates for Mr. B. Right? Mr. B is teaching us how to read Pamela in some way by virtue of his conversion in the middle. Right, so there's a sense in which we read these as something like true. And remember at the end of Pamela, right, he's passing the letters along to other people, which means he's essentially taking the text of Pamela that we have up until that point and giving it to his friends and family to read. Right, so it becomes like Pamela, virtue rewarded, and so can you by reading this. You may also have this transformation, right? You may also get virtue by learning the truth of Pamela, right? By reading the truth of this servant girl who cared about her virtue. So it's Richardson's ambition with Pamela is that, right? And it does rely on some degree, right, on a naive empiricism. That we have to trust the source. But we don't just read it as true because we read it as true. There are several authenticating procedures at work, right? We have the editor who's vouching for this. And then we have within the fiction itself this vouching for the authenticity. So as though we are told over and over again that what we're reading is true for these various reasons. The other reason that might be sort of obscure, might be kind of obscure, is obscure. This is an obscure reason that nobody should know. So don't feel funny if you don't know this. Why would you know this? Is when the passage that I gave you is from Pamela's diary. And this is this really soul-searching passage, right? You remember that she wants to commit suicide. She realized, I'm not going to get out of this. And she finally realized it's just not going to happen. I'm not going to escape. I'm going to die trying to protect myself as much as I can. But I'm not going to be able to, and then I'm going to live with the shame and embarrassment and the awfulness of this, and I just don't want to do it. Right? I can't do it. It's like this is an inescapable situation, and she's really fraught with this, and she's like I don't want to have to go through this. I don't want this to happen to me. I just don't, and so she thinks I'm going to drown myself. Why doesn't she drown herself?
Because she doesn't have rights over her life.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not virtuous. God would.
Right, she thinks about it. She's like, but I can't do this because this would be this unvirtuous thing, and I can't do one unvirtuous thing to justify some other virtuous desire, right? And she thinks about it more, and then she has a way in which she begins to see her own experience, which is different, right? Where she starts to read it through the lens of providence. Who is Pamela is Job. Pamela is being tested. Her virtue is being tested. You may have read something like the history of Mary Robinson, or I'm trying to think of the word. In American studies, there's a particular word for this. I just can't think of it right now. But the captive narratives, captivity narratives. There it is, and way back there somewhere. Captivity narratives. Thank you for all affirming that for me. Todd Thompson will be very pleased that we got that right. Captivity narratives, and when we read captivity narratives, we get this same narrative structure, right? That someone is taken captive, and they have this nadir moment, and then what are they going to do? They're going to rely on providence, and they read themselves, right, like a Job, like a figure in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or whatever you want to call it, that book, right? The controversially named book, right? Whatever you want to call it. We find in there these figures, these icons, right, that are leading exemplary or parable lives. And Pamela, like these people in captivity narratives, is reading her situation through that. In this little diary moment, right? She realizes, right, she's being tested. And what's the great thing about realizing you're being tested?
Having strength to come out of it.
You know
Yes.
there's a way to
Just
pass.
Having
pass.
strength?
Yeah, you know there's a way to win.
There, you know there's a way to win.
Yeah, if you believe you're being tested, then
You believe you're being
there has to be
tested.
a right.
Salt?
Yeah.
You're with that? There's one other like sneaky little belief in there, one other little side benefit you get when you know you're being tested. You know that God cares enough to test you, which means you're important, which means you're elect, which means you're saved. Right? Which is really good stuff to have, right? When you see that, you're like, wait, this is what's really going on. Right? How do I know that I am being tested? Because I'm being tested. Because I realize I'm one of the elect. I am one of God's chosen, and I am saved. And this is my test of faith. That's good stuff if you can get it. So she reads it through that medium. The other aspect of this that's worth thinking about is the notion of diary keeping and spiritual accounting, right? Which is a Puritan, sort of Puritan move. And McKeon talks about this a little bit, but this notion of spiritual accounting and keeping a diary. And so what happens? This is something like we see with the Royal Society. Since, right, you go out and you write down everything you see during the day, little notes, and then at night you sort of write the resume of it. You recapitulate it and put it in some order in an organized way and make sense of what you saw, and you're done, right? That's how you get to the truth of what you see. This is actually a very good way, too, as you read for your comprehensive or candidacy exams, to go about your research. Take little notes. And at the end of the day, write a little, recitation. What did I learn today? What was important? It's a good literary scholar practice. But we have the Royal Society doing this and encouraging this as, right, the method for documenting matters of fact, natural matters of fact. What happens with Puritans and certain versions, dissenting versions of Protestant, but mostly the Puritans, is they take this when it comes to documenting the truth of their own salvation. At the end of the day, you document what you did during that day and you reflect on it, right? This is a purely private exercise in which you're reflecting on what you did during the day. You're looking for signs, you're trying to self-scrutinize. So this is a little tidbit from the Cambridge Companion to Puritanism. As if who would have thought there was such a thing, right? Cambridge Companion to Puritanism. And they write, the writing of spiritual accounts derives from the Puritan commitment to unrelenting, deeply probing self-examination. John Forbes, of course, told believers to be continually searching and trying our own hearts, lest there lurk in them any deceitfulness to beguile us. And his own diary provides a model. Blair reported in 1622 that diligent Christians daily took brief notes of the condition of their souls, marking both what failings and escapes they were overtaken with, as also what speed they came and progress they made in the ways of God, right? And so on and so forth. Another source, this is Puritans in America, I believe. Practicing Protestants, History of Christian Life in America, 1630 and onward. God had commanded his prophets to write, but he had not told them to write diaries, right? So prophets have to write, but not diaries. So why were the Puritans particularly drawn to the practice of keeping diaries, a relatively new form of self-expression in the 17th century, right? We don't have a lot of diaries before the 17th century. This is sort of a new thing that you would do this. You would write down what you did each day. We don't have Caesar's diary. It's not there for a variety of reasons, right? Although there's no simple answer to this question, and many Puritans prefer to express their devotion in other kinds of writing, especially poetry and memoirs, it is significant that diaries, with their chronological dated entries, bear a striking resemblance to both travel logs and account books. It's like accounting. Which is a wonderful exercise before I continue to think about this. What if you did this each night, right? You set up a ledger and you put in the good things and the bad things you did all day, the good thoughts and the bad thoughts. You kept a virtue ledger. Right? It's an extraordinary idea. And you reflected on this. You gave serious time of reflection of this at night. To become a better Christian, to become a better person, to become closer to salvation, to better know the truth of God. And the worry being, right, for those who are aware of the Christian prayer, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and if I die before I wake, I pray to God my soul to take. This is a good way of knowing that God's going to take you if you die in your sleep, right? When you do your ledger, where do you want to be before you go to sleep, in the red or in the black? You want to have a little extra balance of virtue at the end of the day. Right, so it's an experience of accounting in some way. Look at what did I do and where am I in the balance of vice and virtue? I want to be virtuous, right? And they may have imitated account books because they saw diaries as spiritual accountings of sin and grace. Puritans wrote devotional diaries for many reasons: to examine themselves for signs of grace, to heighten their appreciation of God's grandeur, and to fix their thoughts on God rather than the vanities of the world. Instead of imagining their diaries as an opportunity for the free expression of individual creativity, as many Americans do today, right? That's what we think of as a diary. We get the, on the one hand, the sense of, the little girl with her diary, dear diary, guess who I have a crush on, right? That sense in which you're confiding, can you express, and you have little pictures and fantasies, and, it's where you allow all of your interiority to spill out in unfettered form, because it's your place for creativity, right? It's your place for the self, but not in a self-scrutinizing way, right? In this sort of private creative space, right? The Puritans approached their diaries as a space for, as we say again, rigorous self-examination. Indeed, they did not understand writing to be a means of spiritual liberation, right? This is a romantic idea. This is, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, maybe not so much Byron, certainly Blake, right? That writing is a spiritual expression. There's a no, writing is how we find out if I'm good or bad. Did I screw up today? Right? This is where I sit down and I look in the mirror and go, so, here we are. Right? So it's about self-regulation. It's not about self-expression, it's self-regulation, right? Although writing can certainly lead to moments of transcendent union with God, it more typically involved an anguished confrontation with the sinful self. Devotional writing was a difficult and painful discipline. And so we can put Pamela's diary in this context as well. Right? What is she doing particularly in this entry? Right, she's reflecting on what she did and this really, traumatic event, but she's trying to reason through it. She's trying to understand where virtue is interwoven in this, and she's trying to sort of do her spiritual accounting. And we see this if we then look back on other diary entries. This is really what she's trying to do. We read it as though Pamela is trying to convince us maybe that she's virtuous, right, if we're skeptical or suspicious. But if we read it as an 18th century or 17th century Puritan, what we're really seeing is Pamela trying her hardest, right, to be self-scrutinizing. Did I in any way lead him on? I don't think so. Did I in any way invite? I don't think so. This was the problem, and this is really how I tried to reason through it, and I think I was right. And that's what she's doing in many of these diary entries, is trying, or rather what Richardson is doing, is trying to have someone mimic this type of spiritual accounting. At the end of the day, am I virtuous? Pamela, we need to know at the end of each day, Pamela is virtuous, and we know it not by objective facts, right? How would you, right? But rather by her intense self-scrutiny, right? At every moment, she's trying to say, did I do the right thing? Did I do the right thing? Did I do the virtuous thing? And then this moment of near suicide, of desperation, this moment of despair is so important, right? Because it's such a painful moment for self-scrutiny. Pamela, you are so weak. How could you do this? How could you possibly have thought about this? Thank goodness, right? I am no longer in that position. Thank goodness I now have figured out providence. I'm being tested, that this is God testing me, and my virtue is intact. But I was tempted. I was tempted to the greatest sin there is. Me, Pamela. Pamela, you got to take a good look in the mirror, girl. Right? You see, this is where she's at. And so it becomes even more true, right? Because of the admission, right? This painful, indecorous, sinful admission. I was going to kill myself. Right? What servant girl is going to write that if that weren't true? and go through this painful reflection. Right? As you're reading it, you're thinking, one hopes, right? If you're the sympathetic 18th century reader, you're reading it thinking, poor Pamela. Yeah. That's awful. Right? There's a sentimental relationship, and you're reading this, and of course it's true. Of course this is what she's thinking. At that moment in the narrative, by and large, it doesn't really occur to you to doubt that she is thinking this. Her interpretation may not be what you agree with, but we get the sense that this is a faithful relation of her interiority. So we're reading it on one hand, right, with a sense of a naive empiricism, but not 100%, right? That there are features here that seem to authenticate it. We're not just reading it as true because someone told us it's true. It certainly has the seemingness of truth about it in the variety of contexts. I think, but I'll be happy to read your rebuttals. Let's talk about Fielding. Fielding's not having it. He's not having it for a second. What happens in this little excerpt? An apology for life of Pamela Andrews, 1745. Parson Williams to Pamela Andrews. Right? We all remember Parson Williams, right? In the story. If you haven't gotten there, Parson Williams plays an important part in Pamela. Right? Because Mr. B really thinks something may have gone on between the two of them. Even if it didn't, go on. In their hearts it might have gone on. And that's important to him. Right? Because Pamela's got to be virtuous if this whole system is going to work. She can't be hiding anything. And, right, we have to know the truth of Pamela, so he needs to get to the truth of Parson Williams, and he puts Parson Williams through the paces. So here's Parson Williams writing to Pamela and her reflections on it. How are we supposed to read this? What are the claims to truth that are going on? Yes.
I think this seems more realistic than Pamela.
Why is that?
Because there is vibes, not all virtue.
Mm-hmm.
There is the other side of.
We have this vice. It's one of these terrible moments where you have to, it seemed more real because people are bad. And they're not just bad, they're the worst, right? This is a person. This is a man of the church. Right? This is really seedy stuff. And we think that, well, it's more believable because we know people are bad. It's awful. I agree with you, right? But I mean, that's really the truth of what's going on. Is right. We don't want to. For some reason, someone being virtuous just isn't as believable as someone being really, really seedy. Why are we more willing? Just as a pause. Why are we more willing to believe that? That we're more willing to believe that someone is a fraud or a hypocrite.
We have two different narratives,
Mhm.
different perspectives. One, we have Shamila or Pamela,
Mm-hmm.
but then we have another thing that reflects on it. This is what happens. So when you have two narratives, you're more inclined to believe it, I guess.
You're more inclined to believe the one that's nastier.
Maybe the opposite, maybe. Because you ask yourself, why do you have to prove the opposite if it's not even true? So you tend to start,
To raise his questions.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
It seems to have like a quantitative element to it too, where she's like presenting this letter to her mother. She's like,
Mhm.
here, you can see the evidence of what he thinks of me. Like, seems like there's actually data there almost, like a quantitative element.
But we see that in Pamela too, right? She reproduces letters and she copies them. Right? That's part of what Fielding is making fun of, I think.
It's only one narrator. Here it's different. We have two.
Right,
Or
but
maybe more.
it's a collection of letters, right? No, it's absolutely true. What else? What kind of claim to truth is Fielding making here?
The Pamela's are just full of artifice, and that there's a difference between the appearance of virtue and actual virtue.
So what are we reading here?
It's kind of like you've got the person, and he's like, you know, supposed to be this holy man, but here he's doing this, he's like, oh, but we can just repent.
What we're
It's gonna
seeing,
be
right,
okay.
is the unveiling of hypocrisy. So we believe Fielding. We believe Shamala. We believe these letters are authentic and the others aren't authentic.
There's a little bit of both. I said that this is both quantitative and qualitative, and there's a
Right.
little bit of like both to this.
Absolutely. This relies on the same reading practices
Mhm.
as Pamela does.
Mhm.
Right. Okay, now we have the true documents. The other documents weren't the true now we have the true documents.
Mhm.
So it's making a claim if we read it that way, right? And that's how Parson Tickletext reads it. If you remember that we have this artifice, right, of the person is reading this, right? And he reads it as true, like this is the truth, right? But what is Fielding suggesting to us? What does Fielding want us to get out of this?
What's in italics?
Well, yeah. Why do this? Why write this satire on Pamela, or this, you know, this Shamala thing that charges that Pamela is a sham? Here are the real letters. I know the truth. Why do this?
Making a claim that human beings are terrible. Like that we're terrible
Is that
beings.
it?
Like,
Does he want you to believe these letters are authentic?
I think he wants you to question everything. He wants you to believe that nothing is authentic and that we should question everything.
Right.
Is where his point is coming from.
Absolutely. Right. So in Shamala, we get
There's no truth.
Yeah.
right
Fielding
there.
believes there is no truth.
There is no way to prove it.
Yes.
Right. And so this brings us where?
In skepticism. Yeah.
Right, to extreme skepticism. Right? Parson Tickletext read Pamela and he believed it was true. He reads these letters and he believes it's true. The problem is, why are you believing this is true? Right? That's Fielding's ultimate point. Why would you believe this is true? Why would these be more true than the other? Except, right, for a predisposition to believe all human beings kind of suck.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's the only difference, right, on some level, right? And you get a kind of a giddy pleasure. No one wants to read about Pamela being good. What happens when we read about Pamela being good?
We feel bad about ourselves.
We feel
Yeah.
bad.
Less virtuous
can
then.
do that.
But
Yeah,
you
so
read
we
it.
are then less virtuous.
You read Shamala and you feel, you know, if there's a scorecard,
Uh-huh.
if God is grading on a curve,
Yeah.
we're doing pretty well, right? Whereas you read Pamela, and it's just this sense of, you know, I have some thinking to do about me, right? Here is a, right? The sense of the bias that inheres in our reading, which is really important. This is something, right, that people in the 18th century are worried about, the bias of accounting and reading. Right? Why are we inclined to read this as true?
It feels more true because it feels more like your own life. Because I mean, not everyone is perfect. So this you get a flawed character now, and then that flawed character feels more real because human beings are flawed, and I am flawed. So therefore, I
But
feel.
she's pretty flawed.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an unusual level of flawed,
Yeah.
right? That she's had an illegitimate child with the parson. And she's just a teenage girl, right? There's a lot of, when you start thinking about this, and she's trying to trap Mr. B into marriage, and she's scheming, but don't worry, right? Right, I did this just the way you're supposed to do this, just the way you told me to. I write even in italics, see? Right, this sort of, just like you told me to. Right, that's it's sort of this comic sense of, well, we can believe that this woman's just a really bad person, or we move to the next sort of level, which is questioning what do we believe and under what conditions do we believe things, and can documentary evidence like this be relied on? Right, and it can't. It doesn't mean that it's false. It just means that it's not, our key word of the day, quantitatively complete. It's like, I'd be willing to believe Pamela if I saw some other evidence. Preferably evidence that's not written down, right? Because the question and the whole question of part one, questions of truth, is how can you appropriately narrate truth? What makes it credible, right? In this new age of typography, right, where we can mass produce things and write. So it's not like, just we sign our names and signing oaths instead of speaking them, right? That we have books, right? Tons of books, and we're recording things, right? And we want to get facts down. So what makes it credible? How do you represent truth on the page? And Fielding is suggesting to us here, right, that first-hand accounts don't cut it. As attractive as they may be, to use our terrible language of the Obama presidency, our better or our darker angels, right, our biases, that we want to believe them, it's not enough. It's not enough for us to just have the one account. No matter how great Pamela is, or no matter how shameful she seems, right? It has to be true because she's so shameful, right? There's nothing this Shamala is not guilty of, and that's how we know it's true, right? Because nothing has been left out. It's almost like a complete, catalog of ways in which a teenage girl can be bad, that are within her sort of wheelhouse. Right? We don't expect her to be doing devil worship, but an illegitimate child, that could happen. Right? So it's a really interesting, philosophical problem, even as it's a comic satire, right? And even as it sort of pillories what Richardson wants us to get out of Pamela. Right? He's really arguing not about the content of Pamela, but the method of Pamela.
Why not devil worship?
Well, it takes a lot of it. Yeah, it just seems it could happen, but that's pretty improbable.
I guess I was just thinking Salem.
Well, yeah, Shayla, but it's a lot of work. That she only has so many hours of the day.
Yeah.
She has so many other things to be up to. Plus, she has to keep up the facade, right? So she's probably not performing vivisection. She's probably not trying to raise the dead. She's probably not involved in alchemy. She's probably not doing devil worship. She'd need a partner and a coven, and there's a lot of architecture you have to start bringing in.
Certain woman doesn't have access to all that.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and then Pamela's got to be pretty cunning if she's pulling that off, right? We're giving Pamela a lot of credit. Right? We can believe that she's just a scheming teenage girl of loose virtue, shall we say, or virtue, as it were, of loose virtue. Right? She can't even write it down in a true way, right? That's how we know that she doesn't have virtue. She can't represent it with the right words on the page. So what Fielding is really interested in us thinking about is method. The method in which we believe things. What's going on with Robinson Crusoe? Where's my Robinson? Here's my Robinson Crusoe. Got lost for a second. May have a handy table.
Which automatically makes you want to believe it.
Right,
Yeah,
it's
like-
data.
Data.
Yeah, he figured out how to import a table from Excel
Yeah.
into Word, right? He's one step ahead of the rest of us. Right? To the table. So what is he up to? What is Robinson up to begin with, right? In the fiction or the fictional world of the book, what is he up to? Why have this little table, this handy table?
Trying to prove that he can survive
Mm-hmm.
whatever he's going through. Because he's alone and alive, and
Mm-hmm.
he's trying to survive. So he's trying to, make balance of what is happening good with him, what is not.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like that accounting thing you were talking about
Right,
before.
it's
He's
accounting.
accounting for his.
Same thing as Paradise.
Yeah.
But he's accounting, but he's not accounting for himself, right?
No.
He's trying to take an experience, right, which is being shipwrecked, and make a qualitative judgment based on quantitative of it, good or bad, or good or evil. Sorry, good or evil, right? Good or bad. Good or bad, you could do. Is this bad or is this good, right? If we go from sort of Nietzsche's divisions on good and bad and good and evil. Evil is a very different thing than bad, right? Something tastes bad, okay, hey, it tastes bad. Something tastes evil, that's a different judgment, right? Right, what we see him doing is the spiritual accounting, but he's trying to import this framework onto a matter of fact, right? Him being on the island and judge it. Right, through observation and reflection. Right, for every observation, he has the Puritan reflection on it. Then just quickly, we'll get through Swift because I want Nicole to have time to talk to us. What's going on with Swift here?
Swift is. Go ahead.
He's describing the methods of the people that he ended up with.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same thing, providing evidence
Mm-hmm.
with these mathematics.
Yeah, but he's narrating hard
He's
data.
narrating,
He's trying to
but,
narrate
yeah.
like hard data though. He's giving you like
Tangible
Yeah.
details.
Right.
Mhm.
There's several levels in which like belief and truth are at odds.
Mhm.
And this is section 3, or book 3, part 3 of Gulliver's Travels, where he's looking at the scientists and the mathematicians, and Laputa and places like that, and he, on the one hand, right, he's mimicking a member of the Royal Society, right? We're supposed to believe he saw
Mimicking
these things,
scientific.
right?
Yeah, methods of his
Right.
time.
That there's nothing really exciting about how he's writing this. He's just accounting for what he saw. There's no real reflection, or if there is, it's very minimal. And he separates that out, right? When there's going to be his own reflection, he said something. I'm only including this because. As if you've read Gulliver's Travels, there are lots of really interesting moments where he records what happens when he needs to use the bathroom in Lilliput. But I'm only recording this because people are going to point out that I didn't include it, and if I don't include it, they're going to say this is a romance because where's the detail? So he's striving for extraordinary quantitative
So that's
completeness.
extreme I mean, that's like extreme skepticism.
Well, he's the sure. If we didn't see the evidence that you use the bathroom, so therefore we don't believe your story, right? The very skeptical reader. So he's working from his position as narrator, right? He's working as a member of the Royal Society, essentially, right? That he gives a simple language to relay observations. His observations, though, are of what? People who are trying to determine matters of fact in all of these strange ways.
Yeah.
Right, all of these weird apparatus
Yeah.
and methods,
It's like
that,
excessive methods of rationalizing.
Yeah.
things.
and they all look pretty ridiculous. Right? So if we're the naive reader, which certainly Gulliver is a naive reader, right? If we're a naive reader who's reading this, right, we just read it, wow, it's pretty fantastical, or right, but the next remove is, well, if this is a joke about not just what he sees, it's also the joke about how he's seeing it, right? So it again gets us back to this extreme skeptical position.
So would you say he's narrating for the skeptic at this point? Like he's
No.
writing for the skeptic audience almost.
He's writing for the scientific audience that's going to believe it
It's too
because of
much.
its format,
Uh-huh.
right? Because it's given to us as a travel document in plain language by this person, right, who has some, credentials, that of course will believe it, right? Because the way it's written, this is how we get the truth of travel logs. And so on the one hand, it has the invitation because of its form, right, for us to believe it, right? But as the extreme skeptic, right, Swift is inviting us, right, to not believe Gulliver, right? It's not a question of whether or not Gulliver is telling the truth. That isn't this a stupid thing for us to believe people because they have this way of writing down what they see. So I'm going to mimic this exactly how I see other people doing it, exactly how I read these accounts that have been validated or that have been legitimated by the Royal Society and fill it with all this fantastic stuff. And I'm going to put in the most boring personality possible so we know it's true. Right? I mean, he is. Gulliver is one boring guy. Right? And so there's no bias imparted. And then this should meet the same standards of believability as anything that the Royal Society endorses. Right? Yes, it's marvelous, but look how I'm writing it down. That makes it credible. I have a map.
Yeah.
Right? The horses, the Whighams live in Northern California, it seems. Right? Not far from where I'm from. So, the reason I wanted to do this rather than just go point by point today, which we can do, or I can send you my notes, but I wanted to have sort of practical application, right, of where we've come. So are the questions of truth making more sense now?
Yeah.
Right. So as I've got my sort of timeline here, not timeline, but right, we had our romance, and then our crises come in, right? Our Protestant crises, our scientific revolution, and our print revolution, right? Our three revolutions, I should say crises, there are three revolutions that get us now into this split of how we're reading. Where nobody's interested in reading something false. But we have these problems of how do we read and represent the truth? How do I represent truth when it can't be quantitatively complete? There's no way, and this is the little, and then I promise I'm yielding the floor. No, because you have so much to say and you made great slides, and I'll talk forever if you guys don't shut me up. I would keep you here till like 12 each night, and then I go home and my husband would yell at me. But I say, no, I was on a roll, and we do it. So I want to go back to the first thing on the handout, which is Borges on exactitude in science, or rigor in science. This is the whole story, but this is the whole thing, this little clip here. Or there's this, one little part, the citation information I didn't include. Right, but it's a little parable. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West till today, there are tattered ruins of the map inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. This is our questions of truth, right? In one short Borges story, right, brought together. You can't be quantitatively complete. There is always room for skepticism because you can't do it. Right? You can't do it. So how do you do it then? What method do you take to convey matters of fact, to convey some sort of truth? What do you do? And Defoe has a cunning solution for this, right? Which is that, well, as long as there's a good moral at the end of it, right? It's okay to not be historically accurate, but to be to make the claim to historical accuracy if it's in the pursuit, right, of helping people be better people, right? Of pedagogy, of what's the word? It's didactic, right? If it's morally didactic, then it's okay. Right. And McKeon's so disappointed in Defoe at that point. It's like, you're on the edge of this great postmodern realization, man, and you throw it away for didacticism. Right? It's one of my favorite moments is when you can see he's just so disappointed in Defoe. It's like, no, instead Defoe makes the, less interesting choice of, right? And he's so sad. All right. So pondering that question, I yield to Nicole.